Hello and welcome to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. We have a new segment this week where we answer your questions. That's if we're able to. So if you have a question you want to ask us, write to us at Politicon on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook for next week's show. We've been inundated with questions and we'll try to get to most of them. This episode is sponsored by Hydrant, Magic Spoon, and Steady MD. We thank them for their support of the podcast, and we thank you for listening. And please tell your friends and remind them to subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. James, we got a lot to talk about, but was it really a week ago that we did this podcast? It seems like a year. So much. I mean, polls, national and state, show it's time to rev up the bus. The fat lady singing this presidential race is over. Trump got COVID-19, and predictably it brought out all of his evil. That charade pep rally for Amy Barrett at the White House was an infectious landmine. Then he got the COVID-19, went to Walter Reed, forced Secret Service agents to drive him around outside, risking their lives, or their health at least, to salve his insecure ego. And he went to, and actually before that, he went to a fundraiser when he knew he had it up in New Jersey. You know, look, nothing he does surprises us. I'm going to tell you one thing, James. That is, I am a little scared. 26 days to go, facing a big defeat. He has no morals or guardrails. What might he do?
Yeah, I look, I don't know. I wish we'd have had a medical professional to tell us what the side effects of these steroids are. But a friend of mine who's doing well, but had colon cancer, had to take it before treatment. And he said, man, that's going to make you crazy. But besides that, I think there were two really interesting and significant events. The first one was John Cronin, the Republican incumbent in Texas, went to the Houston Chronicle and criticized Trump's response to the virus. That immediately tells you he's getting slaughtered on the west side of Houston and, Woodlands and these kind of places. I mean, he's trying in Texas. And then last night,
districts that used to vote for George Bush.
Yes. This is exactly. He is getting killed by, white college in Texas on the virus. And then last night in Arizona, Martha McSally refused to kind of say nice things about Trump. And they kept pressing her. Now, the Arizona Republicans, there's no lack of right-wing Republicans in Arizona. But the fact that she is in a race and is distancing, you got two people in she's almost an impossible race. She's going to lose. Cronin is in a tough race that most people think he'll probably in the end win. I'm not sure they're right. And I think you're going to see more and more of this. I wouldn't be, you're going to see people trying to distance themselves from him.
Yeah, you do. One thing that it's taken some people a long time to learn, the latest person who should have learned it was the White House physician. And that is that when you lie down with dogs, you get fleas. He got COVID-19. The president got COVID-19. I think most people thought, gosh, I hope he's going to be all right, even those of us that can't stand him politically. But instead, what they do is that they lie and they fabricate and they try to spin this and they make it far, far worse. And that's why the Cornins and the McSallys are in a squeeze. And of course, you would say to them, where you been the last 4 years, John and Martha?
So tonight, a friend of mine pointed out the infection rate on just the White House campus at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is currently 23 times the entire country of New Zealand. Think about that. Mm-hmm. Just that block. So you've covered politics, you've covered people, I've been in it. The greatest aspiration for anybody is to be in the White House, to work in the White House, to be an advisor, be a journalist, be anything like that. It is not probably, I could not imagine a more miserable place to work now.
Oh my God.
The New York Times is not, news organization not even allowing their reporters on the ground.
Well, because at least three reporters have contracted.
Right.
The White House press secretary comes out there proudly not wearing a mask.
Secret Service.
Yeah.
What about the people that work in the White House mess?
James, I'm going to tell you something that's going to shock you. This will shock you. They don't care about those people. They just don't care.
Yes, they really don't. They really don't. And I don't look. I do not want Trump to die from this at all because I want him to go to the penitentiary. That's where he's going. I promise you, and he knows it.
That's why it scares me right now.
Right? No, it should scare you.
I think one of the most disappointing things for me last week was Father Jenkins, the president of Notre Dame, prestigious university, prestigious educator. First of all, he should never have gone to the pep rally, political partisan pep rally, for the nomination of Amy Barrett at the White House. I mean, it's fine for him to endorse his former law professor. If he wants to do that, that's fine. But, that's his prerogative to endorse Judge Barrett. But he shouldn't have gone to that pep rally at the White House. I'll tell you this story. They did something fairly similar indoors when Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, and they told the Supreme Court members this is just going to be routine, and they got there and Trump sandbagged them. He turned it into some kind of really partisan rally again. So you knew it. And then for Father Jenkins, who's insisting on social distancing at Notre Dame, and kids can get kicked out if they don't socially distance, to go 200 people and not wear a mask. I think he's been an admirable man. He heads a fabulous university, but that really, really was just terribly disappointing.
Yeah, I think that Notre Dame of today is not quite the Notre Dame you want to remember.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, look, Father Jenkins brought in Obama. That and caused a big brouhaha in 2009.
Right.
I think these right wingers have got a pretty good toehold in there now.
Yeah.
And no, not to say there's 1,000 top rank academics at Notre Dame. It's obviously a very fine institution, but it's not Father Hepsburg. I mean, the bill. Remember, Bill Barr gave this famous speech about curbs on human rapacity at Notre Dame, and that board. Father Jenkins has a lot of interests he's trying to balance, but he did not do himself. I mean, and these colleges are like kicked. I had my kid at Tulane got kicked out for having a party in his apartment with 12 people in. I mean, just boom, he's gone.
Right. And I mean, A, as I say, he shouldn't have gone. B, he should have worn a mask. It's just incredibly disappointing. Hey, before we turn on to some really fascinating guests, let me just go through. Let's do just a little bit of politics. We agree the presidential race is over. We'll discuss that, in the ensuing weeks. Let's just go to Congress. I've been talking to some people in the House, and Democrats are going to pick up, maybe 15 House seats. That was not thought possible a year ago. And give me, what's your outlook in the Senate now?
Well, but what happens is everybody says, well, there are competitive races there are 10 competitive races. So you figure, well, you should get 5. It generally does not work that way. You're more likely to get 2 or 8. Mm-hmm. All right. In most years, all of the close ones tend to fall a certain way. And right now I'll be very optimistic that we'll be well over, I think we'll be closer to 55 than 50. I really do. Because I just can't see how, given the current environment and the current national mood, and you just keep hearing Republican posters telling people we're doomed, and it got bad over the weekend. It was obviously got bad after the debate. So if I had to bet, I'd bet we right at 55 seats. I really would. And that's really optimistic. That's really, I wouldn't bet that. If you gave me some odds, I'd take it. But that's a high optimistic number. But
yeah, it is. But it's the trend. It's the direction. At least I'm talking to the Michelangelo of American political elections. But it also strikes me, in all that I've covered, that when it's really close at the end, the vast majority of times it breaks against the incumbent.
Yeah, that seemed, Nate Silver had a piece, and the usual was pretty detailed, but it kind of broke a little bit for Obama in 2012. But and the other thing, we were a challenge in '92 at Washington War Room. My students, we actually were more ahead than the vote did, but Perot had a lot to do with that. All right, so I wouldn't say 92 is a good example, but I'm very comfortable in telling our listeners, and you all, because you've covered more elections than I've been in,
Close call.
that they generally it breaks the incumbent's way. I
Right.
mean, a non-incumbent's way.
Right.
That's a pretty general but accurate rule to make about American politics.
Yep.
And now generally the way people do it is you take the incumbent's vote, add what you think the third party vote is, and then subtract from 100, and you end up with the challenger. That is not a crazy exercise. So if you look at, it would produce this result. If you took the CNN poll, NBC Wall Street Journal poll, and they're both telephone polls, and CNN has got hooked up with what I think a more competent outfit than they had before. Trump said, he said 40. Now, that's a ridiculous low number. If we think the third party vote is 2, then that produces a result of, you ready?
Yeah.
58-40.
Biggest landslide since Ronald Reagan in
1932. Oh, way bigger than Reagan, I think.
No, the 84 over Mondale.
84 was that big?
Yeah, but it's one of the largest landslides in American in recent history. Yeah,
but Reagan didn't carry, as I recall, he didn't carry much with the Congress with him.
He didn't. He did not. He did it. He curiously did it. Yeah, an 80 with a much smaller margin. But no, I think you're right. I think the third party vote will probably be somewhere between 3 and 4. But that's you can't. Trump just never gets above 41 or 42, even in his most optimistic polls. So anyway,
I could see. I just want to tell our listeners, it's some chance that this partisanship kicks in. But in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, which we both agree is the gold standard of all public polling,
along with Ann Selzer,
a significant drop in Republican identifiers. Now, they usually come in at +6 Democratic. They were +9. All right, we did a battleground poll 2 weeks ago. And every poll does this, and to just bring our audience to look behind the door, is you put certain tripwires in there to see if, because sometimes your samples are just wrong. I mean, it just is 19 times out of 100, they're wrong, and probably 15 times out of 20, 19 times out of 20. We had, on the voter recall, it was even. So who'd you vote for in 2016? It was even was remarkable. It was more people say that recall voting for the winner. And it jumped to 6. And we never wait for that, but we waited it to 3. It's just internally uncomfortable with that bigger jump. But that does mesh with what the NBC Wall Street Journal poll said, that they got more Democrats. And every time that you talk to a pollster, they'll say, well, it was a heavily Democratic sample. And I think that's a function of people are just not identifying with the Republican Party. At least I hope that is. But that's what's going on underneath in polling.
No, and if what I like to do, I do 2 things when I look at a poll. Some are better than others. First, I'd like to compare the state polls to the national polls, because if Biden is winning by 10, 12, 14 nationally, he's going to be ahead in Ohio. He's going to be ahead in Florida. And they pretty much track. State polls are a little bit closer than those 2 national polls suggest. And the second thing is just to look at their demographics and compare them to last time. And every state poll I've seen in Arizona and Florida and Michigan and Pennsylvania, the demographics, if anything, I think they're pretty down the middle, but if anything, they tilt a little bit are. So there's no question that there's a overall consensus on this, and the great myth is that there's this huge hidden Trump vote. Didn't exist last time, doesn't exist now.
So one thing that's really valuable is Dave Weissman swing-o-meter, and he got these mathematical wizards, and they ran, if you had exact same performance among non-college whites, non-white, boom, 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 in each state, what would that produce in 2020? And Biden wins. If he gets the same turnout, the same everything across the board, that Hillary got in 2016, he would win this election. And you can go to every state and you can see percent non-college white, percent college white, percent non-white, percent black, Latino, and it's a really good exercise. And I think what's going to happen, of course, is not going to replicate the demographic model of 2016. I think you're going to have we're going to get more non-college white votes. I think it's going to be one of the big surprises. You make an excellent point. And it's the same amount of seniors, that seniors are really changing.
Oh, biggest turnaround. It's going to be a remarkable turnaround.
Right.
It really, like plus 20 turnaround.
So the point is, if we just did everything we did in 2016, and I even mentioned the year because it sends people into suicidal depression, we would win. We would win. If we got the same portion of everything else, just because they're more college-educated people and the percentage of white to non-white is rising. It's a fascinating exercise. I recommend it to any political junkie.
All right. Well, this is we got some interesting guests to turn to.
Well, I just want to tell our listeners that if Albert Hunt says we're going to pick up 15 Senate seats, you bet
House
plus or minus.
House.
I mean, not Senate, the House seats.
Yeah.
The House seats. I'm talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can bet plus or minus 2. It'll be somewhere between 13 and 17. I fully believe that.
All right. You hold me accountable.
Okay.
Hey, James, in politics like sports, staying hydrated can make or break you. Ask LeBron James.
Yeah, Al, I'm be 76 this month, and I've been running 350 days a year since 1981. This stuff is really good. I can recommend it to anybody that exercise, particularly if you're older. I'm excited about these guys sponsoring our show. It's a really top-flight product.
Let's give it to Joe Biden the next couple of weeks. Listen, it's made with real fruit juice powder. It's delicious. It's refreshing. It comes in a variety of flavors, including the new keto-friendly lemonade, pink grapefruit, and no added sugar, and only 2 grams of carbs, James.
I like the way it tastes. I think it's really good for you.
Well, they even have a new immunity line in lemon ginger or hat apple cider. Those pack in 1,000+ milligrams of essential vitamins C plus B6, B12, and D minerals, and all 4 essential electrolytes with ginger and zinc. Man, are you going to be healthy. It strengthens your routine even during a marathon campaign season.
Hey.
It's total immune support.
Well, soon to be 76-year-old runner. He loves it.
Well, I'll tell you, we got a special deal for our listeners to save 25% off your first order. Go to drinkhydrant.com/warroom or enter our promo code WARROOM, that's all one word, at checkout. That's drinkhydrant.com/warroom and enter promo code WARROOM for 25% off your first order. That's one hell of a deal. drinkhydrant.com/warroom and enter promo code WARROOM to save 25%. I hope I've gotten that across, and we thank them for sponsoring the podcast, where the water meets the wellness. Hey, James, Dr. Kathleen Belew is a professor of history at the University of Chicago and one of the foremost authorities on the white power movement. She's author of Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America. Dr. Belew, we have a lot to talk to you about. We are honored to have you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
The President and Attorney General Barr dismissed the white power movement as a bunch of kind of straggling guys in a log cabin somewhere, lone wolves, unconnected, no really big threat. You profoundly disagree. Why?
Well, first of all, this movement has been with us for quite a long time. My book is a history of the movement and its formation in the post-Vietnam War moment. And then really charts the way that it evolved as a social movement, largely unopposed, from the late 1970s through the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and went on such that it could be with us in the present.
It's amazing. It's a grab bag of haters and bigots, Klan, neo-Nazis, immigrant bashers, militias, skinheads. You go on and on. Some of the extreme anti-tax protesters, but it's not. I mean, they're connected. I think you point out they have a common purpose, which is really to be achieved by a race war and violence.
Yes. So it's a social movement that, in every way but race, is actually quite diverse. It's in all parts of the country, it's in rural, suburban, and urban areas. It includes men and women and children. It includes religious leaders and felons and veterans and active duty troops. So it really has, it's a small group of people, but it has quite a wide and deeply interconnected fringe footprint. And one of the interesting things about it is that I think people have spent a lot of time trying to categorize the groups that you've just outlined. In other words, trying to count how many Klansmen, how many Nazis, which symbol goes with which group, which slogan should go with which ideology. But that's actually not how this worked for activists on the ground. They often moved between different groups. Many of them had multiple memberships at the same time. So if you look at a major event of this movement, say the Aryan Nations World Congress in the mid-'80s, what you would see is an event that brought together all of these activists in the same place in the name of white power and war on the government. And they burned crosses for the Klansmen, but they also lit swastikas for the neo-Nazis. They heard sermons from Christian identity preachers and also applauded race war. And then they had a big, robust social movement. So they had things like volleyball games and a big spaghetti dinner and, matchmaking schemes to meet, to help young white power activists meet one another.
A volleyball game to celebrate the anniversary of the Third Reich. That's remarkable. Trump is their guy. If he's going to lose, James and I are convinced he's going to lose big. What does this do to the white power movement? Does it diminish them or embolden them to strike back harder?
Well, so one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that he is their guy only to a point. This movement is not at its heart interested in the United States and some version of the United States, which is to say, I think sometimes people hear white nationalism and think that what it means is a sort of overzealous patriotism. But from 1983 forward, the nation in white nationalism is not the United States. The nation in white nationalism is thought of as the Aryan nation. They're interested in a white ethno-state or a transnational white polity. And in some iterations, they're even interested in campaigns to clear the world of all non-white people such that they can have an all-white world. All of this is fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-United States. So to the extent that they embrace Trump, and I think some of them are doing that right now, often what we're seeing is this sort of opportunistic use of Trump for these other purposes, which brings me to, the most dire warning I have right now is that even in the most generous interpretation of President Trump's remarks about the Proud Boys at the debate, the stand back and stand by remark, even if he meant to tell them to stand down, the effect of that comment has been to call to arms an entire array of activists, not just the Proud Boys, but as you say, parts of the militia groups, parts of Boogaloo, as well as a web of underground activists. All of these people are called to arms, and I don't have any reason to think that he also has the authority to command them to stop once he has unleashed that force.
This is a kind of off-ball question, but I've always suspected this. Do people that own these kind of groups, do they experience like sexual frustration issues at a greater percent than the general population?
We don't have information robust enough to make any kind of statistical claim, but I guess I will say that so there are some stories of figures in this movement who are famously sexually frustrated. One of them is David Lane, who's given the nickname Lone Wolf, actually, and one of the reasons that Lone Wolf becomes a moniker for this kind of violence, a false moniker, as we could discuss. So he's someone who is described in the archive quite consistently as being sexually frustrated. But once he does violence for the movement and goes to prison, he then marries someone who becomes an activist in her own right and has several other kind of sexual relationships through pen pal while incarcerated. And so this sexual frustration is sometimes used as I suppose, as a reward for people. And I think I would need to double check my notes, but I believe Richard Butler of Aryan Nations, or one of the other major leaders, said something like, "We will have many wives waiting for Brother Lane when he comes out of prison." And this movement did condone polygamy, so he meant that literally. But so that's the story for some people. But I think I want to underscore to you that this is also a movement made possible by women and women's relationships and women's activism. Historians and journalists have missed that story a lot of the time, possibly because we have an idea of activism that is familiar from kind of a feminist and leftist mode. But these women were doing activist activity to support this work. And by that, I mean they were doing everything from running their own auxiliary groups and printing their own newspapers to sharing homeschool curricula and recipes and coupons and things like that, to things like driving getaway cars and disguising people when they were on the lam. These women were incredibly important to the movement, and the marriages and other social relationships between groups that cemented alliances really relied on women's participation.
That's such a great point, because I get to these things and, the right wingers screaming and everything. And it always seemed to me that the women were more intense in their belief and hatred than the men. I mean, they were just like really, off the wall when they were like interviewing these people that came to Bethesda. There was a lot of women. And, I guess in this day and age, we look at, how active they are. And I think that they are. I think you're exactly right. What you tell me makes total sense. Is there like a publication or a journal that they have? Or is there a site that they go to if people want to learn about it? All these movements have some pseudo intellectual rationale for themselves. Is there any place that people can go get that?
Well, as a rule, I don't like to direct people to the actual movement sites. Some scholarship has indicated that, first of all, that's what they would like to happen because they do get membership that way. I would encourage people to read some of the scholarship and materials that are coming out from people who are watching the movement. So there's a great book coming out by Cynthia Miller Idris about this. There are some excellent resources coming out of outfits like the Southern Poverty Law Center that are keeping track of what people believe and why. And when you think of as one example, the major ideological center point text for this is still the Turner Diaries, which is they would see it as utopian. I see it as dystopian. It's a novel from the late 1970s that was tremendously popular in the movement. And the reason it is so popular, if your reader or if your listeners end up looking at this book, is not because it is a good novel. I think you will notice quite quickly, but because it fills this really critical imagination problem for the movement, which is, how do they think that this very small group of people can possibly succeed in what they want to do? They're trying to take down the most militarized superstate in world history. And they think that a fringe movement can do this, right? It's a huge problem. So Turner Diaries is important because it answers that question. And it lays out, as fantastic as it seems, it lays out a scheme through which a small number of dedicated guerrilla soldiers can create civic unrest and mass violence such that they awaken the rest of the white population, divide the country into partition zones, carry out campaigns of genocide, provoke a nuclear war, and end up taking over the United States. And then, I will add, then committing campaigns of mass genocide on all populations of color all around the world in order to ensure a all-white planet. Now, that I think is clearly that's the kind of the farthest degree of extremist violence within this imaginary. There are people in this movement who are not committed to that entire chain of events, right? Many people argue for something much smaller, like a white homeland or an ethno-state. But the Turner Diaries is still important to them because it shows the path by which you can translate extremist activism and violence into the kind of change that these people are seeking.
Yeah. Christopher Wray, the FBI director, has, I think, been very right? That these groups present, a really clear and present danger, and the vast majority of violent incidents the past several years have come from these hate groups. But you read this: the Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer, seems to really, if not dismiss, downplay that. I mean, do you have any? I mean, that must surprise you.
I think historians are not often surprised by this kind of a problem, but I mean, it's appalling to be sure. The Homeland Threat Assessment that came out yesterday outlines that not only is white power domestic terrorism the largest threat, or the largest terrorist threat to the nation, but that we are in the most violent period we've seen since the Oklahoma City bombing. That report from Trump's own DHS says that 2019 was the most violent year for this movement since 1995 with the Oklahoma City bombing. And just to remind people, the Oklahoma City bombing was the largest deliberate mass casualty on American soil between Pearl Harbor and 9/11, but people are still kind of walking around without an understanding of what that was and what it meant. I think most people still think of that event as the work of one or a few people, perhaps lone wolves, perhaps bad apples, but that event was the work of a social movement. Timothy McVeigh and his co-conspirators were part of this broad social movement. They attacked a building that had been in the crosshairs of this activism since at least 1983. And they did it using playbooks that had been clearly outlined for quite a while, including the Turner Diaries, which McVeigh himself was carrying photocopies from when he carried out the bombing. Now, the fact that we are in this moment of intense fatalities from this movement really requires public attention, because what we tend to do, and this is the result of many kinds of problems, and I'm not blaming any one kind of sphere of our society for this, but what we tend to do is treat this as lone wolf violence. So what we get are stories about the El Paso shooting as anti-immigrant violence, the Christchurch shooting as Islamophobic violence, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting as anti-Semitic violence, the Charleston Bible study murders as anti-Black violence. And they are all of those things, but they are all also white power violence carried out by people who are using the same worldview, the same ideologies, the same symbols, the same slogans, and in many cases who are connected to each other through social network activism, sometimes online. That sphere of mass attack is the same story as the parts of the Boogaloo movement that are interested in race war, the parts of the militia movement that are interested in race war, and the underground machinations of groups like Adam Waffen and the Base, which are attempting mass casualties and paramilitary training, that we won't get the archive of those for another decade or two, but it's clearly happening. So the work ahead is to do, to pay enough attention to this beyond one media moment, but to connect all of these stories such that we can see this rising tide that demands our response.
Wow. Someone send that report to the Attorney General. We learned in journalism when I began many years ago, you just don't mention the word Hitler. You could talk about Stalinist and fascist, but not Hitler. But these guys, these people, men and women, they really are Hitlerian.
That is interesting. I want to hear more about the instruction not to mention that. Anytime people tell you not to mention something from history, it makes me very interested, and my ears perk up and I want to know more.
It just sort of was a custom. It wasn't, it wasn't trying to be politically correct. It's just, no one could be that bad.
You can't compare anything to the Holocaust to slavery.
I see. I mean, I would just say that many of these activists would proudly proclaim their allegiance with Hitler. So, I mean, part of the work here is simply to listen to what they are saying and to take seriously that it represents a coherent worldview.
Right. James.
It's 88 is a big thing. It's the 8th letter of the alphabet, Heil Hitler.
Right.
And 88 is a big. So I'm a veteran. And it's no secret that veterans and police officers have more skill and background. They really try to and I know it's a problem in the Marine Corps, even among active duty, that they're having to deal with. Do they have enhanced recruitment of police and veterans? Is that a part of their target group?
Absolutely. And they've been trying to do that since the post-Vietnam War moment. But let me be really clear about the argument that I'm making in my book about veterans, because I want to make sure that this is clear. There is a relationship between the aftermath of warfare and surges in Ku Klux Klan activity and then later white power activity. If you look at the ebbs and flows of those groups across American history, the aftermath of warfare is a better predictor for intensity of vigilante violence or revolutionary violence by these groups than many other factors. And I would put on that list, it's a better predictor than surges in immigration, civil rights advances, economic problems, or even poverty. So for instance, these groups are very, very quiet during the Great Depression. So we see a clear relationship between the aftermath of combat and white power or Klan activity. So one might wonder whether that has to do with returning veterans. And it turns out that this is not exactly that clear, because it turns out that the scholarship shows that all of American society becomes more violent in the aftermath of warfare. But it's a phenomenon that goes across age, across gender, across service record. All of us are more available for this kind of violent activity in the aftermath of warfare. This raises questions about the integrity of our social norms in those moments. Now, yes, these groups have targeted veterans and active duty troops specifically because they have skill sets that are usable for white power violence. So we see over and over again things like white power groups seeking out veterans and active duty troops specifically to get access to armories and other weapons stores on posts and bases, specifically to do paramilitary training for munitions expertise and explosives expertise, and on like this. However, within the total group of returning veterans or active duty troops, I think we're talking about a very small number, perhaps not even a statistically significant number. It's certainly not the story of veterans in any way at all, but it is the story of the white power movement because those few who do join have this skill set that dramatically escalates the kinds of violence this movement can carry out. And I think that, I think that, the response by the military to this has taken quite a long time to get together. So there was an order in the early 1980s saying that active duty troops could not participate actively in white power groups, but it's not until 1996 that they're prohibited from joining. And not until the last year have they really started to tamp down on things like flying a Confederate flag inside of a barracks. Even though we know that the Confederate flag, which of course has complex meaning, but we know it's been used for Klan recruitment since at least, arguably for more than a century. But I have pictures of white power activists doing this in the barracks in Cu Chi, for instance. So I think reasonable people can agree that there's a problem with that you can't be fulfilling an oath of induction that calls on you to protect the nation from enemies foreign and domestic and be a participant in a movement that is trying to violently overthrow the nation at the same time. I think reasonable people can agree on that. But I think, the Pentagon has really struggled with how to respond and also preserve freedom of association and freedom of speech for people who are serving.
So I think it was Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil.
Yes.
And when I was teaching at Tulane, I had my students had to do a cultural project. They had to go somewhere out of their comfort zone, spend a week in an African American church or on a shrimp boat or anything else. So two of my better students spent a week with the militia, a weekend. And they all gathered somewhere in the Chaffly Basin and they had practice guns and families. And they came back and they said, they actually... they're nice people. They were cooking families and everything, and they were, waiting for the order to start the white revolution or something.
Yeah.
And just as you talked about, they have like potluck suppers, and somebody gets sick, they dies, they bring a casserole over.
Yeah.
They don't just stick out and they look like they're everywhere, and they look and for the most part act like normal people.
Yes. And I mean and the thing to really underscore is that all of that social activity, and I would add to that list, these activists go to church in the movement. They get their marital counseling in the movement. They pick each other up from the airport. They share grocery coupons. They babysit each other's kids. All of that creates this web from which they then can pursue violent activism.
Right. I give our two kids an A+ to say the least.
Yeah.
Well, I give an A+ to our guest, James. I mean, we talk about politics a lot. I think we know a little bit about it. We have learned so much these last 20 minutes. And anyone who's listening, I want you to read Kathleen Belew's "Bring the War Home: The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America." I think she's working next on a book on guns, which I can't wait to read. But she has been one of our great guests, and we thank you so much, Dr. Belew.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
This episode is brought to you by Magic Spoon. As you can imagine, keeping up with James takes a lot of energy. He's always on to something. James, you can answer this question. Big debate. I like frosted. My 2.5-year-old grandchild says, no, Pop, it's blueberry. What do you think?
I'm with the grandchild.
Are you? I thought you'd.
I like blueberry. It tastes good.
0 sugar, 11 grams of protein, and only 3 net carbs in each serving of either the cocoa, fruity, frosted, or my grandson's favorite blueberry, and it really does taste good. It's amazing. I don't like healthy food usually, so that's why this has been such a delightful surprise. And it's keto friendly, gluten free, grain free, soy free, low carb, and GMO free. I mean, you're just left with the good stuff, James. Give it a shot.
You bet.
Go to magicspoon.com/warroom to grab a variety pack and try it today. And be sure to use our promo code WARROOM, that's one word, at checkout to get the free shipping. And Magic Spoon is so confident in this product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee, which means if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money. No questions asked. I like that. Trump donors should ask for something like that.
Right.
That's magicspoon.com/warroom and use the code WARROOM for free shipping. We thank Magic Spoon for sponsoring this podcast. Okay, James, we have Andrew Weissman as a guest. Legendary prosecutor, Robert Morgenthau, Tom Dewey, Elliot Ness wrapped into one. Prosecuted top mobsters, prosecuted the Enron scandal executives, general counsel of the FBI, and senior member of Robert Mueller's investigation of the Russian interference in the 2016 election. Written a new book, Where the Law Ends, Inside the Mueller Investigation, where he thinks his former boss wasn't tough enough in investigating and charging Donald Trump. Andrew, thank you for being with us, and I know you have great respect for Bob Mueller, but the ultimate failure, was it he lost a step or two, he was sandbagged by Deputy AG Rosenstein, or what?
Well, he certainly had a number of challenges. I mean, you have to remember, it's not usual that the people that you're investigating have the power to fire you and to give pardons or dangle pardons. So, you mentioned I prosecuted organized crime cases and I prosecuted Enron. Those are hard cases to bring, but one thing that you don't have to worry about is Enron executives and organized crime figures, they can't fire you and they don't have the power to pardon. So, Bob was facing a lot of challenges. And he also, I think, assumed that Attorney General Barr, who came in at the end, was going to be an institutionalist and was not going to be the person who we now all know him to be. So there were a lot of challenges. Having said that, there are places where in the book I describe, where I respectfully disagree with decisions he made, and I try and lay out his thinking and my thinking.
Right, not insisting that Trump agreed to an interview, not acknowledging that the clear case that you laid out on a cover-up, an obstruction, not stating it specifically. Was Rosenstein the deputy AG? I mentioned earlier, did he really try to sandbag the investigation?
Well, Rosenstein's such an interesting figure because he appointed Bob Mueller. So that's like on the plus side. Here's a negative that I recount in my book, which is he asked our office not to coordinate with any state prosecutors so that we wouldn't undermine any potential presidential pardon. I point out that Mueller's deputy agreed to that condition, which, I don't understand the logic of agreeing to that. So we weren't able to provide the Manhattan District Attorney's Office with the kind of information that we typically would. This is a very timely discussion because I think just this morning, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office won yet another court battle in trying to get the accounting records.
Yeah, he's dead on. I actually read the Mueller report twice, and on the collusion or coordination, maybe there wasn't enough for a conviction, but there's a lot of stuff. But on the obstruction, it was off the charts. Now, I just want to ask you this, leaving aside whether Trump, after he loses this election, which he's going to, if he tries to pardon himself, 2021, if you were the Attorney General, would you prosecute him?
That is a hard question. And this is the problem with journalists interviewing lawyers is, what you tend to get is it depends. Look, on the one hand, you don't want to turn into Ukraine or what Ukraine used to be, where you just go after your political opponents as President Yanukovych did. On the other hand, you certainly don't want to set a precedent where just because you win the presidency, you suddenly aren't going to be prosecuted for crimes you committed either before becoming president or while you were president. But assuming you get through the legal issues, I think there'd be a pretty strong case for holding him to account. This may become somewhat moot because it may be that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office or the New York Attorney General's Office that both have criminal and civil cases that they may actually be able to bring
on separate issues. They're not on the issues that you dealt with.
Exactly, they're
right.
on separate issues.
So you would be inclined at this stage, at least, to let them handle that, and not try to bring a separate prosecution on the obstruction.
I have to tell you, it depends. I know you'd love a clean answer, and I tend to try to do that. But
we love to oversimplify.
Yeah,
Andrew.
I just think that there's so many issues that you'd consider, and one would be if there is another criminal case that's viable that's going forward. That might be another factor. You'd obviously want to hear from the president's for former president's counsel about why we shouldn't go forward. So what I have said in the past is I think the new Attorney General, I think she's going to have a really tough decision on this one.
So first of all, thanks for being on the show. I got to tell you, myself and a lot of Democrats, we don't have a lot of faith in federal law enforcement. And what we would say is, Andrew, so Bill Clinton is being investigated for I don't know how many years, and he has to testify for 2 hours on a case about in a dismissed with prejudice lawsuit about sex. And Donald Trump is being investigated for some of the most serious charges that one can imagine, and his lawyers answer interrogatories. We would also say that Jim Comey stands up and says, we're not going to indict Hillary Clinton, but this was reprehensible conduct. And then a week before the election, he puts out another thing. Then Mueller goes to great things, said, I can't say anything because if you don't indict somebody, it is ultimately fair. If you're not going to put an indictment, don't say anything. Now, if you want to know how great a person Jim Comey is, please ask him. He'll tell you. Why? The press had no outrage at this. No one said, she didn't have a chance to answer himself. They said, we're not going to charge her, but what she did was terrible. Of course, if we found out, it wasn't very bad at all. And if you can name me the last Democratic special prosecutor, I'll fall out of this chair because I can't remember it. And I just think that, I know you're part of it. I think you're an honest guy. I don't know if you have a partisan political bone in your body, but I think on the whole, this whole crap is very pro-Republican. That's just my view.
So let me, I address a lot of that in the book, and I am no fan of Jim Comey. And I think what he did in July and in October of 2016 is beyond deplorable. It violated all DOJ guidelines, and I don't buy for a minute I was between a rock and a hard place, and I only had two choices. One of the choices he could have made in October was to actually do the investigation of the, which only took a week, and they found that it was completely duplicative. The other, which I recount in my book, is he actually knew at the time that there were other emails out there that Huma Abedin had, but they'd already made the decision that they were highly unlikely to be relevant because she didn't perform that kind of role with classified information. And, one of the things I recount is, where was that in the letter? In other words, if he's going to submit a letter, how about putting in the fact that you'd already made a determination these were unlikely to have anything, as opposed to dangling them out there as if this could be, the mother lode. So that was really harmful to the Department of Justice. And I agree with you. I worked for the department for 20 years, and I'm one of those, career people who work for Democrats and Republicans. We keep our head down, and it doesn't matter to us whether we're prosecuting a Democrat or a Republican. We just look at the facts and the law. My concern, switching to the comparison of Clinton and Trump, your point about, should Trump have been subpoenaed, is, with all due respect to Bob Mueller, who was motivated by, the purest of reasons in terms of trying to be fair to someone, to the presidency. My concern was exactly, I think, what you're getting at, which is this idea of what's the precedent you're setting, where the next, God forbid, the next special counsel or independent counsel we have that's investigating the White House, it's going to be really hard to insist that the president actually sit down for an interview, because they're going to point to what we did and said, look, in a case that's really serious, with really crimes that could be go right to the heart of a criminal investigation, where his intent, the president's intent, is so central. Even then, you didn't require him to sit for an interview. You had just a few written questions, and not even on everything. The written questions were only on the obstruction and not on the Russian interference. So I was very concerned about the precedent we were setting. And again, total respect for Bob Mueller. He's a patriot, and he was not acting out of any improper motivations. But I just respectfully disagree with that call.
Yeah, and William Barr. Here you are. You're a career prosecutor by everything, a really good one, but one of the legends. And William Barr, who is the Attorney General of the United States, just flat out lied about your report. Did that make you angry? Like, how could that guy say that?
I open the book with March 24th, 2019, a day I still remember. I'm driving to Washington from New York, where I live, and CNN reports on his so-called summary letter, his 4-page letter, and I just thought that CNN just got it totally wrong. I thought that can't possibly be the case. And then I got home in Washington, pulled up the letter, and I recount both in the beginning and the end of the book all of the ways that it was at best misleading. Here's just one example of that. Even with Russian interference, he couldn't bring himself to say it accurately, and just said, well, Russia was trying to sow discord in the election. That's not what happened. Russia, and it was devastating, overwhelming evidence, Russia was on the side of Trump. They were trying to get Trump elected, both in the primary and in the general. And they were trying to suppress the vote for Hillary Clinton with respect to trying to get black and brown voters not to support her, trying to get Bernie Sanders supporters to not like her. And he couldn't say that. He couldn't bring himself to actually just be honest about what happened. And this is where, now it's a commonplace to look at what Barr did and say, of course, he's political. But at the time, when we first saw that letter, we knew that Barr was not an institutionalist and that he was going to undermine the rule of law, which, by the way, is the impetus for why I called the book Where Law Ends, which is a reference to a quote that is on the limestone walls of the Department of Justice, which is where law ends, tyranny begins.
Right. Albert, to you, but make one question. You just said that the Attorney General of the United States tried to undermine the rule of law. That's not a minor observation. Thank you, Albert.
Well, it's in the tradition of John Mitchell and a few others, but it really is just stunning. Andrew, I just want to go back. I want to wrap up a couple things that still perplex me because I followed this pretty closely and I knew some of these characters. Roger Stone, 2 weeks earlier, he had said Podesta's emails are going to come out. We know the Russians did that. They did come out. We know Stone was in touch with the Russians. I've always wondered why that was not a prosecutable case, and also about why you recommend bringing Stone back before a grand jury next year.
So, I mean, obviously, Roger Stone was prosecuted for something that was really clean and clear, which was his lying under oath to Congress. So a lot of times what you do as a prosecutor is you pick your cleanest and clearest and strongest cases. And I sort of discuss that in the book about decisions we're making so that you don't, this is something that you do even before the special counsel's office. I used to tell my attorneys, don't look for gray. In a criminal case, that's not what you should be doing. You should be looking for clear violations of the law. And what I say with respect to Roger Stone is, look, we don't know yet. Why did he lie to Congress? Why not just tell the truth? What was it about the truth that was going to be so harmful? Well, now that he's been given clemency by the president and he's avoided any jail sentence, that should not be the end of it. If you want to know what happened, you can just put him in the grand jury and ask him the questions. And the first questions I would ask is, why did you lie to Congress? And I know a lot of people who are listening might just say, well, he might lie again. Well, guess what? If he lies again and Trump is no longer the president, he can be prosecuted and he won't get clemency the next time. So let's get at the answers.
Did you have suspicions, beyond suspicions, about how he knew in advance that the Russians were going to put out the Podesta email? And also, by the way, point out they put it out the day, and they put Hillary's email out the day, hours after the Access Hollywood. That did not seem to me to be accidental timing.
Of course not. Let's have a grown-up conversation. I mean, these are Roger Stone, for all of his faults, is a smart, wily guy, and he's been in this business for a long time. This is no accident. And so what you want to know is, what were his conversations with WikiLeaks? What were the communications? And what were the communications with Donald Trump and the Trump campaign to coordinate this? But there's no way that the release of those documents an hour after the Access Hollywood tape was coincidental. That was clearly something that was planned to try and distract from, a really devastating story.
And the Russians had to coordinate it with somebody, or had to get a heads up from somebody. But let me ask you, let me just try one more. The Christopher Steele dossier. A, raw intelligence file that exaggerated some stuff, got some stuff wrong, but got the main points right. Or B, a partisan hit job or a victim of Russian disinformation.
So, I don't know the answer to that, just because it was so irrelevant to what we were doing in the special counsel investigation. I know there's a lot of press and speculation about how it played into what the FBI was doing prior to our being on the scene. And there's obviously clear evidence that that was not the impetus for opening the investigation. But in terms of what we were doing, it played, I know for Team Manafort, which I led, it just had no relevance. It wasn't going to lead to sort of the concrete evidence that you need for an indictment or a report. So, my guess is it's probably a mixture of both things. And a lot of times intelligence is like that.
So, Andrew, I've been not a very good law student, a worse lawyer, and I've been in the bar since for 30 years now. But my understanding of law is, if the new attorney general comes in and tells General Flynn or Roger Stone, we're going to immunize you against anything you do with self-incrimination, but we can't immunize you against perjury, that judge can force them to testify. Is that correct? Is that a correct interpretation of the law?
James, you do not need to go back to law school, because that is absolutely right. That immunity replaces your Fifth Amendment. In other words, you can say, I'm not going to testify because I'm concerned about criminal exposure. The government can then confer immunity on you and you can be forced to testify. But that does not give you immunity if you then choose to lie in the grand jury about what you're asked. So, with Roger Stone, that's a clear thing that can be done. With Michael Flynn, it's not clear we're even at that stage yet. Because it's not clear that case, what's going to happen in that case now, because Judge Sullivan's still deciding it.
Yeah, that guy that Gleason or whatever his name is, I wouldn't want that son of a bitch after me. I'll tell you that.
Well, James, I have to defend him. When I was a young prosecutor in the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn, I went to the organized crime section as a young attorney in 1992. And my boss at the time was John Gleason, and he was in the middle of trying the John Gotti case. And he is a phenomenal lawyer, phenomenal prosecutor. And he wrote, I thought, a very clear-eyed and devastating brief.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my impression, I've read about him and I watched the, Heroes channel about how they took the mafia down. And he's as responsible as anybody for doing that. I mean, he really was.
Absolutely.
Highly competent man.
Yep, highly.
Albert, to you.
The Dunham investigation. Is it on the level, do you think, Andrew?
Here's a really concerning fact that we all know. His number two, Nora Dennehy, resigned just a few weeks ago with no explanation. Not only did she come back to the U.S. Attorney's Office to be on this investigation at his request, her husband is the number two person in the Durham, Connecticut U.S. Attorney's Office. So she has, deep ties to John and to that office. You do not resign with no explanation from an investigation this important unless something is deeply wrong. If it was for personal reasons, something would have been put out saying that, so that there wouldn't be this kind of speculation. And the only thing I think the public, of which I'm now a part, can hope is that that is a real brushback to John Durham, that, you really have to adhere to longstanding DOJ policies, that you do not do what James Carville was talking about. You do not do what Jim Comey did in 2016. You do not bring these kinds of cases shortly before an election unless there's...
And is he willing to stand up to the Attorney General?
We shall see. He certainly didn't when the IG report came out, and he issued a press release that was bizarre, and he received a lot of criticism. He, as you may recall, he issued a press release saying, we've got a separate investigation and we know a lot of other factors and we disagree with the IG. And it turns out, after the IG testified, the disagreement was on something really arcane that I know about because I was the general counsel of the FBI, which was the level of predication under internal FBI rules that would have made no difference at all to anything that the public cares about. So that press release was unusual, to say the least. But I think he got so much negative attention. You're hoping that John is really going to adhere to the finest traditions of the department.
So, Andrew, my nephew was the youngest U.S. magistrate, just like in Middle District of Louisiana. He's like 36. He's summa cum laude, Georgetown Law, as opposed to his uncle. And he said, Uncle James, they can get anything that they want as long as it's not your lawyer or your wife. And the point is, federal law enforcement has staggering power. And that power at times can be misused. Are you confident that the internal checks within the Justice Department are such that we won't have a replication of apparently the Ted Stevens thing was pretty egregious? I know the thing in New Orleans where the whole office had to resign. They were writing letters to the editor under fake names. Are you confident that the internal checks in the Justice Department are sufficient to make sure that power is used for the best of purposes?
I'm not. Let me start by saying the vast majority of career people are doing the right thing, and we all would be extremely proud of them. But when you've got leadership that is not displaying the attributes that we care about, it makes it very difficult. I'll tell you a quick anecdote, which is when I was investigating Enron, we talked to the head of the compliance program at Enron. I mean, that sounds like a joke right there. And he actually was a really good guy. And he was saying, look, Andrew, what could we do when you are trying to instill an ethical culture, but the company is run by Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling? It doesn't matter what we do, because the people at the top are setting, an example that makes everyone know that what we're doing is a window dressing. So, that's my current concern. And whenever we're in the post-Trump era, I think that the Department of Justice is going to have to go above and beyond in terms of transparency and being really clear about what they're doing and why they're doing it, so that there can be a restoration of confidence in the Department of Justice that we believe in the rule of law and we're not a banana republic.
All right. Well, just so you want to make one and turn it over to Al, but I love having you on the show. You're a very honest guy. Brendan Sullivan represented Ted Stevens and represented the client in New Orleans. And he said the New Orleans office was 3 times worse than what they did to Stevens. And Brendan Sullivan is a pretty good lawyer. I think we'll agree on that.
Yeah, I think he's I've heard he's not a potted plant.
Yeah, I cannot.
I tell you, I want Judge Gleason, Brendan Sullivan, or Andrew Weissman if I get in trouble with you, James. Listen, Andrew, you have been terrific. You've given us lots of time. It's lots of insights. The book is Where the Law Ends, Inside the Mueller Investigation by Andrew Weissman, who, as James says, is a legend. Andrew, be safe, and I hope we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, I'd love to run into you when all this crap is over and have lunch at the Palm.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
People all over the country are feeling this anxiety, and they should turn to Steady MD. That's your personal doctor online. It's telehealth done right. First, you take a quiz to get matched with a licensed primary care physician who understands your lifestyle and your health needs. Next, you have a 1-hour appointment with your doctor to start a real relationship, and after that, your doctor is available to you anytime by text, phone, or video chat. The doctors take their time to listen and give you the personal attention you deserve, James.
You get a lot of anxiety here, and you watch Trump's doctors. Of course, they like everybody else with Trump. They're forced to lie. But I tell you, this product, these doctors are going to tell you the truth every time.
It sure is, and I'm lucky. We have a great doctor, but a lot of people don't. This is unlimited access to a doctor for only $99 a month, all with no additional visit fees or copays and no insurance required. SteadyMD is now accepting members of all ages. James, it goes up to us in all.
If I got to talk to my doctor, I just FaceTime.
Yeah.
I don't need to drive to
right.
LSU Medical School.
It's in all 50 states. You go to steadymd.com/war room to take the free quiz and see which doctor is a perfect fit for you at steady.com/war room. No risk, no long-term commitment. Just get started. Steady.com/war room. And we thank them for sponsoring this podcast. James, we have a bunch of questioners who have sent in, I think, some really challenging questions, and let's try to deal with them. Simon from Queensland, Australia, where they have compulsory voting, looks at America and he says, I often hear I don't vote because my vote doesn't count, whether I'm living in a red or blue place. So it does count. And let's talk about 2 places that it might count. Do the Democrats have a shot at flipping Texas or Georgia?
You have to say that they do. All right. Because in Texas and Georgia, you both had enormously high Republican turnout in 2018, and they were both really close. And I just don't buy it. What's happening is everybody thought in Texas particularly was could be driven by demographic change with more non-whites being a greater percentage of the state. And what happened in 2018 is we have a massive shift among college-educated whites. Georgia, you have shift among college-educated whites, but you really have an influx of non-whites in Georgia. And people forget there's a lot of African-American in-migration in Georgia. And I got to tell you, I think Georgia is a better chance than Texas, but not by much.
Well, let me go to the question of does your vote count? Because, we're talking about a presidential race. We're talking about 2 Senate races in Georgia and 1 in Texas and some really important House races. But there is the Texas legislature, also Georgia, but really Texas, which has been dominated by Republicans for 25 or 30 years that could flip. So, yes, your vote does count. And the Democrats have a real shot at flipping that Democratic state House in Texas.
Right. In Georgia, they have all the county elections. I was reading about when that county is going to turn totally Democratic. So they're voting for the county commissioner and the assessor and everything else.
James, we got several questions here. We got Alex from Oregon is asking a question, and then someone else on the North Carolina Senate race. Cal Cunningham the Democrat caught in a sexting scandal of sorts. Tom Tillis has COVID-19 and has assorted other problems. How does it shake out 26 days out?
Well, look, I'm very, follow that very closely. And you can't say it's good news about Cal Cunningham. Having said that, it's embarrassing. It's a setback. I think it's, as of now, even with some new revelations coming out yesterday, I would put that in the survival category right now. Survival. I mean, it's not anything you want, but just given everything that's going on and given everything about Trump and the Cal Cunningham stuff looks, we can't say Boy Scouts anymore. the Cal Cunningham stuff looks very, very minor compared to, I love the Stormy Daniels, Melania Trump back and forth. Whew. I could go a year on
that. We have Sheila and others talking about what happens in 2022. She's looking way ahead. The House often flips back then. What are the Democrats and Republicans going to look like 2 years from now, James? We assume Trump's going to lose big. The Democrats will take the Senate. They'll add to the House. So what are the two parties going to look like 2 years from now?
We disagree on some things, but we agree on many things. The one thing we agree on is Tom Edsall is probably as good an observer and commentator on American politics as anybody. And he has a great piece today where, he goes to different academics and people just on how the parties will reconstruct after the 2020 election. Another significant event that people have not paid enough attention to is Senator Pat Toomey, a Republican of Pennsylvania, saying he's not running again. The 2022 Senate map is as bad for the Republicans as any map I've ever seen. I don't think the Democrats have one vulnerable Senate seat up in 2022. And you're talking about Rubio in Florida, an open seat in North Carolina, open seat in Pennsylvania, Portman in Ohio, a probable open seat in Iowa. Ron Johnson might be, and this is a very, very, very tough call, but might be the most odious person in the entire United States Senate. He's up in Wisconsin. And there's some view that one of our guests, David Wickler, the chair of the Democratic Party, is considered justifiable.
Ben Wickler.
Ben Wickler, I'm sorry. Is considered to be one of the best party chairs, in that he's actually considering running for the Senate. And I think a lot of people think that'd be a good idea.
He'd be an awful strong candidate. Ken also wants to know about anything more on the Trump's finances, about his tax scams, money losing, money laundering, golf courses, obligations to Putin, oligarchs. The Times story was a tour de force on his taxes, and there's a lot more to come, and it is a roadmap for those prosecutors starting in January.
It sure is. Everybody's kind of forgotten about it.
Right. They won't forget. I'll tell you this much: the Manhattan DA, the New York Attorney General, ain't gonna forget about it.
No. And yeah, they interviewed, but idiot Eric yesterday about conflating values to get loans. You can get in real trouble for that. If you go to a bank and you say you're worth $100,000, but in fact you're only worth $50,000, you can go to penitentiary for that. And I would, of course, no one would put the Trump family beyond doing anything crooked, would you?
Oh my gosh, how could you possibly suggest that? I mean, look, they were the architects of Trump University, and we know they wouldn't do that. Listen, these
what about
questions.
Trump water, Trump steaks?
Well, that's true too, and you had wine too. I never drank it.
Yeah, the wine I think is still good.
You drink Trump wine?
No, I don't drink it, but I think it's still in business.
Oh, is it? All right, good. I'm glad you don't drink it. Listen,
No.
These are really good questions. Please send some more in next week, and we'll. I hope you don't stump us, but we'll have interesting conversations about it all.
Yeah, and always tell us where you're from. We're interested in, chatting with people all around the country and even Australia. Maybe
Yeah.
we have foreign audiences here, international.
Wow, our reach, I'll tell you, James, from Paris, Texas to Paris, France. Sure. Hey, this was a terrific show, and thank you for listening to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. Remember to tweet your questions for next week's show at Politicon. Thank you for subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. Please rate the show with a 5-star review. We'll be back next week as the countdown to this crucial election continues. Please register to vote. We're not a nonpartisan enterprise, but an exception. There's a great group called Our Time, Our Vote to promote and facilitate voting for people with disabilities. There are more than 38 million people with disabilities, and voting has been more challenging for them, and many have more at stake. This was started by Quinn Bradley, and you can go to Our Time, Our Vote. Only you have the power to change the course of this country. It's in your hands, so please tweet your questions to Politicon, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, James.